Collective defined contribution, also known as CDC for short, is a new and quite complicated concept in workplace pensions. The concept was developed by the Royal Mail in conjunction with their trade union, and it will be set down, if all goes to plan, as the new retirement benefit scheme for their workforce. The Department for Work and Pensions is currently consulting on legislation that the government will require to lay down to make this type of arrangement possible. The priority for the government is to put in place legislation that enables the specific scheme designed by Royal Mail, but they're also consulting more widely in case the concept in the future has broader appeal. Over the course of this short video, what we're going to do is we're going to try, in a simplified way, look at the concept of CDC. We're going to consider some of the major challenges, and we're also going to consider the longer term potential which CDC may have. So let's start by trying to understand this new concept. We know that in DB or final salary schemes, the employer takes on the cost and the risk in the main, and that we know in traditional DC schemes, most of the cost and most of the risk sits with the employees. CDC is a new concept. What it looks to do is to spread the risks that sit with the employees across an entire workforce, even across generations. People who are in the workforce at the moment, people who have previously retired from that workforce, and people who haven't entered that workforce but will do so in the future. The way that CDC looks to share those risks, it looks to tackle the investment risk and also the annuitisation risk. As we know, investment markets rise and they fall, and depending on the date or the year in which you retire, the value of your investments may be high or they may be lower. And CDC looks to set a long-term investment growth assumption which spreads out the risk of those fluctuations in investment returns. CDC also looks to tackle the annuitisation risk. Similar to investments, depending on the year and the timing of your retirement, the annuity rates may be favourable or less favourable. For example, your pension pot may be able to buy you an income which is 1/20th of the pot per annum, or at another point in time it might be 1/30th. In a CDC scheme, the scheme will assume a long-term annuitisation rate, and over time, all scheme members retiring will get a pension that's equivalent to that long-term assumption. As we know in our industry from our experience of working with defined benefit schemes and also with profits funds, when you make long-term assumptions, you need to continually check that those assumptions remain sound over time. Invariably, there will be variances, and when there are variances, you need to fine-tune the scheme in some way. There are three ways in which you could fine-tune a scheme of this nature. The first would be to vary the contributions so that people put more money in. The second would be to vary the investment philosophy or approach, but that might perhaps make the scheme a little bit more risky. And the third way to do it would be to vary the income that's being paid to people who have already retired. Now, the government who are running this consultation have said that they don't want to vary the contributions and they don't want to vary the investment philosophy. And therefore, the variable in the event that some fine-tuning does need to be done would be the income in retirement. So while CDC removes two risks that we're familiar with in DC, the investment risk and the annuitisation risk, it does introduce a new risk that we will be unfamiliar with here in the UK, and that risk is that your pension payments in retirement could vary unexpectedly. So now let's think about the three main challenges in designing a CDC framework. The first is going to be communication. It's going to be important that scheme members know the different way that retirement income will behave, quite differently from DB schemes, differently from annuities. It's also going to be important for those designing the pension dashboard to be able to articulate the fact that we now have a third type of scheme with benefits that will behave differently from both DB and DC. The second major challenge is going to be something that we call the anti-selection risk. It's an actuarial term that we're familiar with in the insurance world, where individuals quite understandably will act in the best interests of themselves and their families against the interests of the collective. And that will be possible in CDC. For example, if someone comes to retirement and they realise that investment conditions or annuity rates are favourable to the long-term average assumed by the scheme, they may want to transfer their money out and get a better deal for themselves and their family. However, that would undermine the long-term collective nature of the scheme. There's two ways to tackle the anti-selection risk. The first would be to remove the pension freedoms so that once your money is in, you're subject to the rules and constraints of the scheme all the way through retirement. And the second way would be to apply a market value adjuster when the investment conditions are varying from the long-term assumptions, or an actuarial reduction when the annuity rates are varying from those long-term assumptions. The government has said it's in favour of giving members of CDC schemes access to pension freedoms, and that they're looking at calculating a fair value in terms of a transfer value from a CDC scheme if a member wishes to do that. The third challenge is the challenge of income varying in retirement. We obviously want to minimise the number of occasions when retirement income might vary in the future, and we want to minimise the magnitude of those variations. From our experience in managing with profits funds in the past, we know that by building up a buffer in the good times, there is money in the bank to give back to scheme members in times where investment returns have been less favourable. The government has some concerns about the concept of a buffer, and those concerns come from the perspective of introducing an intergenerational cross-subsidy. And so we have to await the government's conclusions in that regard. So let's think about the future for CDC. We know that the priority is to establish a scheme for the Royal Mail. The Royal Mail has a workforce with unique characteristics. It's a very large workforce, and the workers tend to stay with that employer for most of their working lives. That's relatively unique in the private sector, and therefore the exact template developed for the Royal Mail may not be easily replicated elsewhere. However, if at some point in the future individuals were allowed to pick their own pension scheme rather than the scheme selected for them by their employer, as we see in Australia where 15% of people do choose their own pension scheme, then it may be possible for super trusts to be created on a CDC basis where individuals who are attracted to that type of arrangement can choose to join one. As we know, when people reach retirement, they leave a scheme and they become an individual in their own right already. And it may be possible to establish collective arrangements on a decumulation-only basis. However, the thing that I find most interesting is the component parts to CDC itself. The pooling, smoothing, potentially guarantees, and of course the illiquidity premium. These concepts are being discussed once again, and we could find that these concepts find their way back into workplace pensions in various shapes and guises in the future as a result of this consultation. In terms of what's next for CDC, well, we do need to wait until the government publishes the conclusions of its consultation exercise, and I'm certainly awaiting those results with interest.